Most trains are just trains. They get you from one place to another. They run on schedule or close enough. You sit, you wait, you arrive. The journey itself doesn't really matter. But there was one train that was different. One train where the journey was the entire point, where the destination almost seemed secondary, where stepping on board meant something beyond simply leaving one city and arriving in another. The Orient Express ran between Paris and Constantinople, later Istanbul, for nearly a century. It crossed rivers, mountains, and borders. It carried kings and diplomats, writers and criminals, lovers and spies. Tonight, we're going to ride it. Not to get somewhere, but to understand what that train actually was, and why, more than 100 years later, people are still talking about it. If this kind of storytelling is what you come here for, a quiet subscribe means a lot. Now, let's board. In the 1870s, Europe was a continent divided by borders, languages, and railway gauges that didn't always match each other. Getting from Paris to Constantinople, if you even attempted, it meant changing trains multiple times, waiting in cold stations, dealing with different ticketing systems, and accepting that comfort was simply not part of the arrangement. A young Belgian engineer named Georges Nagelmakers thought this was a problem worth solving. Nagelmakers had traveled to America and seen the Pullman sleeping car. The idea was simple but powerful. A private sleeping compartment on a moving train, where passengers could actually rest during overnight journeys. In America, it worked. Nagelmakers wanted to bring that idea to Europe and then take it much further. He didn't want to run a sleeping car service. He wanted to run a hotel on wheels, a train so comfortable, so beautifully furnished, that the journey itself became the experience. The obstacles were enormous. European railways were operated by dozens of different national companies. Each had its own rules, its own interests, and very little enthusiasm for sharing tracks or revenue with an ambitious Belgian who wanted to connect the entire continent. Nagelmakers spent years negotiating. He charmed railway officials, courted investors, and eventually secured the agreements he needed. In 1872, he founded the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits, the International Sleeping Car Company. The name alone was a statement of intent. The company's first luxury sleeping service launched in 1876, but that was only the beginning. What Nagelmakers truly wanted was a train that would run all the way from Western Europe to the edge of the Ottoman Empire, a single, continuous journey through the heart of a continent. A train that would make the distance between Paris and Constantinople feel like something that could simply be sat through in comfort, with good food and a glass of wine in hand. It took him years, but eventually he made it happen. On the evening of October 4th, 1883, the first Orient Express departed from Paris's Gare de l'Est. Nagelmakers was on board. The inaugural journey of October 1883 was not yet the full route. The railway infrastructure between Vienna and Constantinople wasn't complete. Passengers travelling all the way east would have to disembark in Romania, cross by horse-drawn carriage, and then by ferry to complete part of the journey. It was not elegant, but nothing about it diminished the occasion. Nagelmakers had invited a group of journalists and dignitaries to accompany the first run. He understood that the Orient Express needed to be a story, something people would read about, talk about, and want to experience for themselves. a train that generated its own mythology. Among the passengers was Henri Opper de Blowitz, a celebrated correspondent for the Times of London. He would later write a detailed account of the journey, and his descriptions give us one of the clearest pictures of what those first days on board were actually like. The train departed Paris in the early evening. The platform at Gare de l'Est was crowded with onlookers. There was something theatrical about it. The gleaming dark blue carriages, the brass fittings, the white-gloved staff standing at attention along the platform. Once inside, passengers found themselves in a world designed to contradict the very idea of travel discomfort. The dining car was panelled in carved wood walnut and mahogany with upholstered seats in deep velvet. Crystal glassware caught the light from oil lamps. Linen tablecloths covered tables set with proper silverware. The food was serious. Not merely acceptable train food, but a full dining experience, with multiple courses, wines selected to match each dish, and service delivered with the formality of a Paris restaurant. The sleeping compartments were small, but carefully considered. Each had a made-up bed, with proper bedding, a fold-down wash basin, and enough space to change clothes and feel something approaching privacy. After years of slouching upright across Europe in ordinary carriages, this was extraordinary. De Blowitz wrote about lying in his berth, watching the darkness of the French countryside pass outside his window, and feeling something unusual for a man on a train, entirely at ease. The journey took the train through Strasbourg, Munich, Vienna, Budapest. Passengers watched the landscape shift flat farmland, giving way to the hills of Bavaria, then the Danube Valley, then the wide plains of Hungary stretching toward the horizon. At each major stop, the train was greeted with curiosity. Local officials came aboard. Crowds gathered on platforms. The Orient Express was news. When the train finally reached its eastern terminus after the overland sections and sea crossing that completed the route, the passengers had been travelling for nearly a week. They had eaten well, they had slept in beds, they had watched Europe pass outside their windows at a pace that felt almost leisurely. Nagelmacher's had proven his point. A long journey didn't have to be an ordeal. It could be, if the right conditions were created, something close to a pleasure. The Orient Express, as most people imagine it, a single continuous rail journey from Paris to Constantinople, didn't actually exist until 1889. Those 6 years between the inaugural run and the completed route were spent building railways through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The Balkans were geographically challenging and politically complicated. The Ottoman Empire had its own interests. Railway companies negotiated, agreements collapsed, and were renegotiated. In Bulgaria, engineers blasted tunnels through mountains. In Serbia, new lines were laid across rolling hills. In the Ottoman territories, the connections that would allow a train to roll all the way from Paris to Constantinople were slowly, very slowly, put in place. On June 1st, 1889, the first fully continuous Orient Express service departed Paris and arrived in Constantinople without requiring passengers to disembark and travel by other means. The journey took just under 68 hours. 3 days across the entire breadth of Europe. The route became fixed in the imagination of anyone who heard about it. Paris, Strasbourg, Munich, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Sofia, and finally, Constantinople. Each city was a chapter. Each border crossing was a reminder of how many different worlds the train passed through. The landscapes alone made the journey worth the ticket. Leaving Paris meant rolling through the gentle French countryside fields, small towns, the occasional chateau visible in the distance. Germany brought denser forests, river valleys, the smell of cold air that came through the ventilation. The approach to Vienna offered elegant architecture glimpsed from the tracks. Then the character of the journey changed. Past Budapest, the train moved into the Balkans. The terrain became rougher. Villages were smaller and further apart. The architecture looked different. The language on station signs became unreadable to most Western European passengers. The sense of moving through a different world, older, less hurried, shaped by different histories, began to settle over the carriages. And then, after another day of travel through Bulgaria, the train arrived at the edge of Europe. Constantinople, now Istanbul, the city where East genuinely met, West where minarets stood against the skyline alongside Christian churches, where the Bosphorus shimmered between two continents. For passengers arriving after nearly 3 days on the train, stepping out into that city must have felt like arriving at the end of the world, or the beginning of another one. The Orient Express was not simply a comfortable train. It was a deliberate statement about what travel could be, and the people who designed it understood that every detail mattered. The carriages were built by workshops in Paris and Belgium, and later by craftsmen across Europe who specialized in fine woodwork, upholstery, and metalwork. Each car was treated less like a vehicle and more like a room that happened to move. The dining cars became the most celebrated part of the train. Early dining cars were paneled in carved hardwoods, walnut, teak, mahogany with intricate marquetry inlays depicting flowers, geometric patterns, and occasionally landscapes. The ceiling panels were painted or lacquered. Lamps with Art Nouveau glass shades cast warm light over the tables. The tablecloths were white linen. The cutlery was silver-plated. The glasses were crystal-heavy, proper crystal, the kind that made a clear ringing sound when touched. Passengers who sat down to dinner on the Orient Express were not eating on a train. They were dining in a moving restaurant that happened to be crossing the Alps. The kitchen cars were equally impressive, if considerably less glamorous from the outside. Professional chefs worked in narrow, efficient spaces, producing multi-course meals from fresh ingredients that were loaded at major stops along the route. The menu changed as the train moved east. French cuisine in the early part of the journey, Hungarian and Balkan dishes appearing as the train descended into Central Europe. The sleeping cars evolved over decades. Early compartments were relatively simple padded benches that converted into berths, with curtains for privacy. By the early 20th century, the cars had been rebuilt and refined. Private compartments with connecting doors, fold-down wash basins with running water, properly upholstered seats, and reading lamps positioned for actual comfort. The fabrics chosen for the upholstery were important: deep blues, burgundies, and greens colors that felt rich under lamplight and didn't show the dust of long journeys. The carpets in the corridors were thick enough to absorb sound, which mattered enormously. One of the most consistent pleasures passengers described was the quiet inside the carriages. The sound of the wheels was always present, but muffled a steady rhythm rather than a noise. By the 1920s, when the Orient Express reached its golden age, the carriages designed by René Preux and later René Lalique had become works of art. Lalique designed etched glass panels for the dining car walls, frosted scenes of nymphs, forests, and rivers that glowed when light passed through them. The effect was extraordinary. A dining room that seemed to exist slightly outside of ordinary time. Passengers who travelled on the Orient Express in its prime often described the interior as feeling permanent, stable, warm, enclosed, which was deliberately intended. The designers wanted passengers to forget they were moving. They wanted the train to feel like a world that had always existed and would go on existing, regardless of what country was visible through the window. The outside world passed. Inside, the world stayed still. The Orient Express was expensive, very expensive. A ticket from Paris to Constantinople in the early 20th century cost the equivalent of several months' wages for an ordinary European worker, which meant the passengers were not ordinary European workers. The train became the preferred route for a very specific kind of traveller, diplomats moving between European capitals and the Ottoman Empire, aristocrats making the journey east for reasons of business, politics, or occasionally adventure, wealthy tourists who wanted to experience the journey itself, and a rotating cast of figures whose reasons for travel were, to put it politely, not always obvious. European royalty used the train regularly. The kings of Belgium, Romania, and Serbia travelled on it. Sultan Abdulhamid II of the Ottoman Empire was transported on a special imperial carriage that could be attached to the Orient Express. European heads of state used it for discreet diplomatic journeys at moments when they preferred not to advertise their movements. Diplomats made up a large and consistent part of the passenger list. The route between Paris and Constantinople was one of the most politically active corridors in Europe, touching Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Balkans, and the Ottoman Empire, all of which were in a state of constant and complicated negotiation throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A diplomat travelling by Orient Express could leave Paris on Monday evening and arrive in Constantinople by Thursday morning. That speed and reliability mattered. Important documents, sensitive agreements, and urgent communications moved with the train. Then there were the others. The Orient Express attracted a certain kind of traveller who valued anonymity. The route passed through enough different jurisdictions that a person could, with the right documents, move across Europe with relatively little scrutiny. Journalists, intelligence agents, people carrying things that didn't appear on their official passenger documentation. There were also simply adventurous travellers, people wealthy enough to afford the ticket and curious enough about the world to want to spend 3 days moving through it slowly, watching the landscape change, talking to strangers in the dining car, and arriving somewhere genuinely different from where they started. By the 1920s, the passenger list had expanded to include a new category: celebrities, artists, writers, film actors, and prominent intellectuals who treated the train as a way to be seen in transit. The Orient Express had acquired a reputation that made travelling on it a statement in itself. You were not just going somewhere, you were going somewhere on the Orient Express, and that was a different thing entirely. In 1928, Agatha Christie boarded the Orient Express for the first time. She was travelling alone, following the end of her first marriage, heading east toward Baghdad and the archaeological digs in the Middle East that would eventually shape much of her later life. She would return to the train many times, and in 1934 she published Murder on the Orient Express, the novel that would, perhaps more than anything else, define the train's identity in the popular imagination for the next century. Christie had written many detective novels by then. Hercule Poirot, her Belgian detective with the precise moustache and the methodical mind, had appeared in numerous cases. But Murder on the Orient Express was different. The train was not just the setting, it was the central character. The premise was simple and brilliant. The Orient Express becomes snowbound in Yugoslavia, genuinely snowbound, cut off from the outside world. A passenger is found dead in his locked compartment, and Poirot, who happens to be on board, must solve the case using only the people and clues available within the train itself. Christie used the train's architecture with great precision. The compartments, the connecting doors, the dining car, the corridor, each space becomes part of the puzzle. The locked nature of the snowbound train mirrors the locked room of traditional detective fiction, but expanded across an entire carriage's worth of suspects. The novel was an immediate success, but its deeper effect was on the image of the Orient Express itself. Christie wrote about the train with obvious affection. She described the warmth of the dining car, the peculiar intimacy of spending days in close proximity with strangers, the way the rhythm of the journey creates its own suspended reality. She made the train feel not just glamorous, but enclosed a world apart, where normal rules had been set aside. After Murder on the Orient Express, the train existed in two registers simultaneously: the real train, running its routes across Europe, and the fictional train, the one that existed in a permanent 1930s winter, always snowbound, always containing one more secret than any passenger had admitted to. Christie herself continued to travel on it throughout her life. She met her second husband, the archaeologist Max Mallowan, partly through the connections she made on trips east. The train was woven into her life not as a backdrop, but as a thread through it. When she died in 1976, the Orient Express was still running, and her novel was already considered a classic. The two had become inseparable, the real train and the imagined one existing alongside each other, equally famous, neither quite eclipsing the other. The decade between the two world wars was the Orient Express at its finest. Europe in the 1920s was recovering economically, socially, psychologically from the devastation of the First World War. And in that recovery, a particular mood took hold among those who could afford it: an appetite for beauty, for travel, for the pleasure of being in a beautiful place among interesting people. The Orient Express fitted this mood perfectly. The Compagnie Internationale de Wagon-Lit invested heavily in the train during this period. New carriages were commissioned. The interiors were redesigned in the Art Deco style that had become the dominant visual language of the era. Clean geometric patterns, lacquered surfaces, inlaid metals, carefully considered proportions. The dining car of the 1920s Orient Express has been described by numerous passengers and historians as one of the most beautiful rooms in Europe, on wheels or otherwise. René Lalique's glass panels caught and diffused the lamplight. The tables were immaculately set, the wine list was serious, and the food prepared in a kitchen smaller than most apartment bathrooms was genuinely excellent. The passenger lists of this period read like a catalogue of the era's most interesting figures: the composer Arthur Honegger, the poet Paul Morand, who wrote affectionately about train travel, various members of European aristocratic families who still moved between estates, capitals, and resorts with the ease that wealth afforded, King Boris III of Bulgaria, who was known to occasionally ask the driver if he could take the controls himself, which, somewhat remarkably, was sometimes permitted. The train also attracted a growing number of American passengers, wealthy travelers doing the Grand European Tour, who added the Orient Express as the eastern punctuation mark of their journey. For Americans in particular, the train represented something that didn't exist at home: a deliberately unhurried luxury, rooted in the old world's understanding of how travel ought to feel. But the 1920s and 1930s were also the years when the train's more shadowy reputation solidified. Espionage and the Orient Express had become linked in the popular imagination, not without reason. The route passed through the most politically volatile region in Europe. The Balkans were newly redrawn after the First World War, full of competing interests, unstable governments, and intelligence services from a dozen countries operating in close proximity. The Orient Express, moving reliably between Paris and Constantinople, became a natural artery for information, documents, and the people carrying them. Whether more spies actually travelled on the Orient Express than on other routes is impossible to say. But the combination of political geography, an enclosed and anonymous travelling environment, and the train's glamorous image made it the setting that fiction and rumour attached itself to most readily. The Golden Age lasted until September 1939. Then it ended, very suddenly, and the train entered a different kind of history. The Second World War stopped the Orient Express entirely. The train that had spent decades crossing Europe's borders with a kind of sovereign indifference to politics found itself at the centre of exactly the conflict that made European travel impossible. German forces occupied the route. The carriages were repurposed, requisitioned, or simply left where they stood when the operational requirements changed. Some of the Orient Express's most distinctive carriages had dark moments during the war years. One carriage, number 2419D, had a history that stretched back to the armistice of 1918. It was the railway carriage in which Germany surrendered at the end of the First World War. Hitler had it brought out of a museum in 1940 to the forest of Compiègne to sign France's surrender in the same space. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. The carriage was later destroyed. When the war ended in 1945, Europe began the long work of reconstruction. The Orient Express was restarted first partially, then more fully, but the world it returned to was not the world it had left. The Iron Curtain now divided Europe. The train's route passed through countries that had become part of the Soviet bloc: Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania. Travel across these borders was complicated, scrutinized, and frequently obstructed by officials who treated foreign passengers with suspicion. The easy, elegant transit of the pre-war years was no longer possible. At the same time, aviation was changing everything. The first commercial jet passenger services began in the late 1950s. By the 1960s, flying from Paris to Istanbul took a few hours rather than 3 days. For diplomats and business travelers, the traditional core of the Orient Express passenger list, the aeroplane, was simply faster. The Compagnie Internationale des Wagons Lits responded by cutting costs. The legendary dining cars were reduced to ordinary restaurant cars. The famous blue livery faded. The service became more functional and less special. The passengers who remained were those who couldn't afford to fly, or those travelling for reasons that made a train journey preferable. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the route continued, but it was quieter, slower, and nothing like the train that nagelmakers had imagined a century earlier. The last through train service from Paris to Istanbul ran in 1977. After that, passengers could still travel the route by train, but with connections, waiting times, and none of the continuity that had made the original journey feel like a single experience. The Orient Express, as a continuous luxury service, had ended. What remained was a name, a memory, and a reputation that refused to diminish simply because the train had stopped running. In 1977, the same year the last direct Orient Express service ran to Istanbul, an American businessman named James Sherwood attended an auction at Monte Carlo. Among the items for sale were 2 original wagons-lit carriages from the 1920s Orient Express. They were old, worn, and had been repurposed for various uses over the decades. But Sherwood recognized what they were. He bought them. Then he went looking for more. Over the following years, Sherwood tracked down original wagons-lit carriages scattered across Europe in Yugoslavia, in a station in Monte Carlo, in various states of disuse and disrepair. He purchased 17 carriages in total and began what would become one of the most extraordinary restoration projects in the history of transport. Teams of craftsmen worked for years to return the carriages to their original condition. The marquetry panels were painstakingly repaired, missing sections recreated by artisans who had to learn the techniques used in the original construction. The upholstery was replaced with fabrics matched as closely as possible to the original designs. The brass fittings were restored and polished. The kitchens were refitted to function properly while maintaining the period appearance. On May 25, 1982, the Venice Simplon-Orient-Express made its inaugural journey. Sherwood had added Venice to the name because the route now began in London. Passengers crossed the Channel by ferry, boarded a connecting British Pullman train, and then joined the main carriages at Boulogne for the journey through Paris and across Europe to Venice. The response was remarkable. The train sold out immediately. Travel journalists wrote about it with an enthusiasm that hadn't surrounded a railway journey in decades. Passengers described feeling as though they had stepped backward in time, sitting in compartments that had carried kings and spies and writers, in a space that felt continuous with the golden age the world had lost. The Venice Simplon-Orient-Express has run ever since. It carries passengers between London and Venice, or on extended routes to Prague, Budapest, and occasionally Istanbul. The carriages are the original 1920s vehicles, older than most of the people on board, still functioning, still beautiful. It is expensive, considerably more so than any other train in Europe, and it continues to fill. Because some journeys are not really about the destination. There is a particular quality to long train journeys that is difficult to find anywhere else. The movement is constant but smooth. The landscape changes slowly enough that you can watch it field by field, town by town, the gradual shift from one kind of place to another. You are moving through the world, but not yet in it. The train is a space between departure and arrival, and that in-between quality gives it a different quality of time. The Orient Express understood this and built around it. Every detail of the train was designed to make that in-between space as comfortable as possible. The warm dining car was a place where strangers sat across from each other for hours, and sometimes ended up talking about things they wouldn't have said in any ordinary room. The sleeping compartment was a private world, small enough to feel secure, with a window that turned the passing darkness into a kind of theatre. What the train represented beyond the luxury, beyond the famous route, beyond all the stories attached to it, was a particular idea about travel, that the journey matters, that moving slowly through the world is not a waste of time but a different way of seeing it, that there is value in being unreachable for 3 days, enclosed in a warm carriage, watching Europe pass outside. That idea didn't die when the service stopped. It's why the revived train sells out. It's why people still read Christie's novel and picture themselves in compartment number 4. It's why the name Orient Express still carries a weight that no other train's name quite matches. The route still exists, more or less. You can travel by train from Paris to Istanbul today, with connections and some patience. The border crossings are different. The politics have changed. Some of the countries the train passed through no longer exist under the names they had in 1883. But the rails are still there, and the distance between Paris and Constantinople is still the same. The Orient Express was many things. It was an engineering project and a luxury product. It was the setting for one of the most famous detective novels ever written. It was a corridor for diplomats and a workspace for intelligence agents. It was a place where a traveler could eat well, sleep properly, and watch a continent change shape outside the window. But mostly, it was a train that took the simple act of going from one place to another and made it worth remembering. Not every journey needs to be that. Most trains are just trains, and that's fine. But once in a while, it's worth traveling slowly, worth watching the landscape instead of the screen, worth sitting at a properly set table with a glass of something good as the darkness outside moves past and the destination is still hours away. The Orient Express understood that, and perhaps that's why, long after the train stopped running its original route, the name still means something. Some things are worth the long way around.